Hey guys, welcome back to the Duly Diagnosed podcast where we discuss all things mental health related. Today we've got Lario back in the studio with us. Lario is a counselling psychologist in private practice. She also provides psychotherapeutic interventions at ARC Recovery Centre. So today we're going to be discussing how to identify when substance use becomes a problem. Lario, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Just a reminder to everyone out there, please hit the like button for this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we put out there. Lario, cool. Thanks very much again. So let's get right into it. I know that substance use only becomes a problem when it's a problem, right? People can drink normally and have a couple of drinks and sort of not do donuts with the car and sort of wreck the house, right? At what point does it become problematic?
So I think that's a very relevant question because I think we get those questions on a daily basis where people would either phone in or come through to the centre to request the assessment or evaluation to determine has my substance abuse or has my family member's substance abuse really developed to a problematic state. So I think maybe let's start, and when I look at anything similar such as addiction, I try and look at it in a biopsychosocial model. So maybe if we start with the biological components of it or the physical side of it, they would generally classify that substance use becomes problematic once one of two things happen on a physical basis. So number one is that you start experiencing withdrawal symptoms when you are not using the substance. So basically if you maybe used on a daily basis and now abruptly stop ingesting or taking the substance and then start experiencing on a physical level side effects, not necessarily side effects from using the substance, but now from not using the substance. Withdrawal symptoms can actually be any form of physical ailments that a person may experience. I think some of the most common ones is that people would complain of experiencing nausea, some headaches. So basically experiencing like a tremor or a shake. Some people might experience some shortness of breath. I think those symptoms combined would often indicate that a person is now possibly experiencing withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal, however, only happens...
So sorry,
yes.
these are general withdrawal symptoms that apply to most substances, right?
Yes, true.
Okay.
So I think when we look at drug abuse, we often find that there's a lot of stomach issues, diarrhea or upset stomach, constipation. So that's quite prevalent or common to drug abuse. Where with alcohol abuse, we find a lot of tremors, like I said, a lot of nausea, headaches. And then with medication abuse, it can be a combination of both. We do also often find stomach issues that patients complain of in the first couple of days of not using.
But it's not to say that you have to have those symptoms for it to be an issue, right?
No, not necessarily. That I think we need to look at addiction on a continuum. So we need to identify that we're not only talking about the most extreme forms of symptoms. This would be in a typical case of somebody who might have been using for a couple of years maybe or even months, but you're completely right. It's not to say that if you don't experience any withdrawal symptoms that there is no problem. That comes more than from your psychological withdrawal symptoms, and some of the problems and issues that you may be experiencing in your environment or in your social circle, which we'll get to. But I think in the more severe cases, people often dismiss or minimize the seriousness of physical withdrawal symptoms, but they are quite serious, so they might attribute it to a cold or that they're just feeling under the weather and not really realizing that it is actually withdrawal symptoms.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I always used to say that if my grandmother drank a bottle of brandy, she'd also do donuts with the car and make a scene and wreck the house, right? The difference between me and my grandmother, though, is I would also do that. I'd do the donuts and so on. But I'd swear blind I'm never going to drink again. And the next day, I would be doing it again, whereas my grandmother would swear blind she's not going to do it again. And she'd stick to that commitment, right? So I think kind of, the colloquial term powerlessness, that's one of the it's powerlessness and unmanageability, right? So the powerlessness is kind of like, I can't bring myself to stop, or despite the fact that I'm deciding to do so. And the unmanageability is kind of like the constant drama that I'm experiencing, right?
100%. So I think powerlessness fits into the whole thing that it's not necessarily making a commitment to other people that you're going to stop using or use less. It's that you genuinely make that commitment to yourself. You climb into bed promising yourself, almost out of sheer desperation, that tomorrow I'm not going to use, or I'm going to use a lot less. And you actually go to bed with that intention, believing it, wanting it, and then the next day it can be due to multiple factors, whether it be withdrawal symptoms or other triggers throughout the day that leads a person kind of, they refer to it often as a obsessive compulsive type of urge to need to use. It's not even more a want. A lot of the patients will explain to me it feels like really a desperate need. Which will then trigger the fact that they break their own promise to themselves or their own commitment or intention and still go and use the following day. And I think that's where things like guilt and shame kicks in again, which becomes another precipitating factor for them to continue using.
Because I mean, the guilt and shame comes along because it's like I make that commitment, but and it's normally I make that commitment because of some kind of consequence, right? And the problem arises where I continue using or drinking or whatever, despite all of those crazy consequences.
Yes.
So landing up in hospital, I mean, I remember for me, I literally landed up in hospital with a brain injury, and I was in there for several days, and I got out and I swore blind. That was it, because I mean, obviously the brain injury was as a consequence of the drug use or the drinking. And I swore blind, and the day that I got out, I was back at it, which was very scary. And that went on for months and months. So
and I think that's why a lot of my patients will tell me, they shouldn't come and tell us about a rock bottom, because there is no such thing as a rock bottom. They feel they can always go lower or deeper. And, I think when we talk about powerlessness, we need to take into account tolerance that obviously you build on a physical and an emotional level. And obviously for those at home that don't specifically know what we're talking about or referring to, tolerance is basically that eventually, as we said, it's on a continuum, so it becomes progressively worse. So as you build on a psychological and a physical level, a level of tolerance to the substance, you eventually require more of the same substance on a more regular or frequent basis to get the same effect. So you might envision yourself, tomorrow I'm going to wake up, I'm going to have 2 beers and that's going to be it. Then you have those 2 beers and you realize, but it hasn't really done anything to me, because now 2 beers isn't enough anymore. Now I need 4 or 8 to get the same effect. And obviously if you're already intoxicated, your rationality is affected and compromised. So then after those 2 beers, it's much easier to give into the next 6 or the next 12. So I think that it's a vicious cycle, at the end of the day.
So again, like you mentioned, it's only a problem when it's a problem, right? So and we discussed some of the biological elements to it. A big one would obviously be interpersonal relationships taking strain, right?
100%. And I think people, I've often asked some of my patients, how is your addicted affected others? And a lot of the times the answer that I receive is it hasn't affected them. I haven't asked for money. I haven't asked them to come pick me up at some shady place 2:00 in the morning. I pay with my own money. I drive myself. But they're not often considering the emotional impact on the individuals around them at the end of the day. So I would often find that they would say, I don't know why my family is overreacting. It wasn't that bad. It's not like I did this or that to them or asked them for this or that. But at the end of the day, they should realize that their families go to bed with that anxiety, that frustration, maybe feelings of hopelessness or powerlessness themselves, for the fact that the person is not calling, returning phone calls maybe, that the person might not have come to work without some form of an excuse.
And I think that can snowball, because people get so you go out and you make a scene and you get drunk and you use or whatever the case, and you don't come home, and the wife or the parent or whatever the case gets anxious. and then you kind of like, you're dismissive about that, and you shove that under the carpet, and then so the more it continues, the more anxiety it causes for the other person, the more sort of complaining they're going to be doing, and that's just going to keep on escalating, right?
Yeah, and I think what a lot of my patients have said to me is the problem is the conflict becomes the excuse or becomes the trigger or the reason to go and use again. So you might come back from a hard days of work. You've already drank in lunch or used in lunch. You come home and you are almost looking for that conflict or that fight at the end of the day. Anticipating it. And the moment you receive some form of negative feedback or feelings of judgment, then it's a reason to say, okay, well, let me grab my keys. You just gave me the excuse to go use again, which is actually unfair towards the family or, the loved ones, because like you say, it becomes a snowballing effect. Now a person comes home, you sober up, next morning you wake up, you realize everything that you've done or said or didn't say.
Guilt and shame.
Yes, that guilt and shame makes you pick up the next one, which causes more problems. And eventually you're not drinking or using to cope with yesterday's problems. You're drinking and using to cope with yesterday and today and tomorrow's problems.
So I don't want to distract too much from the topic, but how is it that we can get people how is it that what process do you take to get people to have some sort of insight into the fact that they're causing problems for the families? I mean, you mentioned that people say, well, I'm not causing them a problem, I'm doing it to myself. Is there a process that you follow?
I think what's quite effective is to try and get them to put themselves into the other person's shoes. So really to ask them, if this was your partner and your partner went on a Friday night and disappeared up until Sunday, what would your response be? What emotions would you go through? It's difficult sometimes if it's a child with a parent, because if that child, him or herself, doesn't have children yet, you can't really try and put them into that parent's shoes, because if you're not a parent yet, it will be difficult to relate to that level of anxiety or worry at the end of the day. But that's one part. And I think another part's asking the family to really write maybe a letter or something containing what they went through, because often this communication happens whilst the person's under the influence, and if you're under the influence, you can't process emotions the same way as when you're sober. So often you're still very defensive and somewhat in a self-pity mode maybe.
Or in denial.
Or in denial.
But I think that's also interesting, because I think that's where a lot of a group therapy can really help for things like that, right?
Yes, 100%, definitely. Because, I mean, for us to say, but consider this or to consider that, it sinks in a lot more, or it's more relatable if you hear it from a fellow addict, somebody who says, but listen, you should maybe consider this or this. That's definitely the way in which they bounce off of one another. And help each other gain that insight definitely is very much beneficial.
I think, so okay, cool. So the family member writes this somewhat of a scathing letter, sort of outlining very specific instances of dishonesty, of whatever, drama. And what I've noticed is a lot of family members sometimes are very worried about the reaction that they're going to get from the person. Any comments on that?
I think you should leave the person with that letter for a day or two. It's not something that I'm going to read in front of you and then respond or react. I think it's something they need to sit with for a while to really go through it, maybe reflect on it a bit with other individuals, somebody that's objective. I think having more than one letter, because if 5 people tell me the same thing, then it seems to be a little bit more authentic than it coming only from one family member. So I think having different types of letters could also help at the end of the day. But yes, I think giving them a bit of time to process it and read through it could help make it a little bit, or diffuse some of the emotions around it. But I also urge the family members, when they do write letters like that, to not just focus on the grocery list of events. On this day this happened, on that day that happened. It's also about saying, what was the emotions attached to it, because that's actually what you want the person to realize. And when I work with the patients, I often tell them that's where you start with making amends or rebuilding trust. You start with the apology. But the apology isn't just, I'm sorry, that day I wrote off the car, or that day, I took 20 Rand from your purse, or that day I showed up with without an excuse, or it's about saying, I'm apologizing for the emotional impact that the behavior had on you. I'm sorry that I ever made you feel lonely or anxious or upset, because that's what you technically want to protect your loved ones from. You don't want to unnecessarily have to make them feel anxious or lonely or powerless, or, so that's kind of what you're more apologizing for. So if it's just a grocery list of events, we often find people get fixated on the nitty-gritty technicalities of it. No, it wasn't that day, it was this day. Or, yes, that part's true, but this part had a different context to it. So it's not really specifically about the behavior or the event. It's more about the emotional impact of all of this on the person.
Okay, so we've done biological, we've done interpersonal, I think social.
Yeah, so the social part is more environmental, obviously, at the end of the day. And I mean, that's where the unmanageability part comes in, is one needs to see in my own environment which aspects of my life was affected, So I often say to the patients, if substances only affected your health, probably none of them would be sitting in rehab, because, I mean, we do a lot of things. We eat a lot of sugar or, eat takeaways that also affects our health, but we don't go to rehab for it. It's because of the fact that it affects so much more aspects of a person's life.
I know for me, I remember my counselor in treatment saying that she hadn't had a drink in 7 years. And I remember thinking, that's impossible. That's not possible. She's just saying that because I'm in rehab and she's trying to help me, right? Like, surely she has a drink around the braai, and I know that was because of the sort of social scenario that I'd set myself up with, is that everybody around me drank and used, and so much so to the point that I convinced myself that nobody was sort of free of that. Everybody that I knew drank, and if they told me they didn't, they were lying. So I think, from a social point of view, I think it's very difficult when you've set yourself up with this community of people that all use and behave in the way that you do. It's difficult to kind of see that for what it is.
100%. And I think that's often the feedback that we get, especially with some of the females lately. They would tell me, but most females or moms or whatever, or housewives that I know of, they drink a glass of wine while cooking. Why can't I? And we have a running joke that said a few years back in Cosmopolitan magazine, they had an article that said you should drink 1 glass of red wine a night because it's good for you, So, but at the end of the day, I always say to the people, don't compare yourself towards others, because you will always find somebody that's using more or having more extreme consequences associated with their using, and you'll always be able to find somebody that uses less than you probably and has less consequences. But at the end of the day, that doesn't serve any purpose. You should compare yourself to yourself.
Well, I mean, I think so I don't know what this would sort of fall under, but I think it value systems. So again, in a social context, if I've set myself up with a bunch of friends and people around me that all share the same value, which is like, let's party, and that's a value that I have. I know for me, it's not necessarily a value that I consciously sort of thought, hey, this is my value. My value was always, hey, I want to be a good person. I want to be, I had ambitions. I had things that I wanted to get to do, and I knew I wanted to be a good person, but the way I behaved sort of presented as though I had these values which, aligned with this deviant, destructive, chaotic behavior, right? So how do value systems sort of come into the equation?
Definitely. I think, it's more how your personality changes when you are under the influence, and we often speak about the real self versus addict self, or your value system versus character defects. And at the end of the day, if you tell me, but Lario, I'm actually quite a responsible person, I'm punctual, I appreciate being honest.
Value loyalty,
yes,
things
loyalty.
like that, yeah.
And if you're not sure what your values are, I always say, what do you seek in others? Because you want to surround yourself with people that share the same values as you. So you wouldn't necessarily want, if you're looking for a partner that's honest, that means you obviously should harbor the same value. You can't have double standards and expect a partner to be honest, but you can, maybe not be honest. So at the end of the day, when you're sort of sober versus when you're intoxicated, you need to ask yourself, how blurry does that value lines become?
Well, it's like, I value being a good dad, okay? But divorced parent, haven't seen my kid for 3 weeks. And I'm at home and it's a Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, and I'm having a drink. It's like, okay, cool. You value being a good dad? What the hell's going? What are you doing here now?
Yeah.
I think if you want to get a good idea of what your values are, you look at your behavior, not what you think your behaviors, your values are, right? Or not what you say they are.
Yes.
It comes back down to behavior, I think, and your actions. Yeah.
And I think we get a lot of double standards, So let's say you're a manager and your employees come in late to work, and you, suspend them or offer them, or serve them with a written warning or whatever the case might be. But now Friday morning you're hungover and you pitch up at work at 10, and you expect everybody to excuse that type of behavior. That's where the double standards,
Okay.
I think that's why a lot of patients at rehab would tell me, I haven't looked at myself in the mirror for a very long time, physically looked at myself, because I don't recognize a person staring back at me. And I think on a psychological level, that's where that disconnect happens, because who you want to be or who you are, your values and your morals become completely construed, or the opposite, where a person would say, sure, but this isn't really me. I was always an honest person or a punctual person, or now my behaviors is becoming,
incongruent with what I'm,
yes,
with what I think I believe.
Yes,
yeah.
But I still preach being this person. But everybody around me can actually say, but your behaviors don't align with what you're preaching or what you're judging other people for. And I think that's important. And again, that's where guilt and shame comes in, and that becomes, again, a trigger. And then eventually, obviously, if people tell you, but you're this type of person, or you're lazy, or dishonest, or then it, worthlessness creeps in, and a feeling of hopelessness to say, sure, but if everybody views me this way, then what's the use of trying to be a good person? Then I'll just continue drinking or using to kind of numb all of those emotions and feelings.
Okay, so we've done biological, social, and interpersonal. We're missing what? Psychological.
Yes.
Okay.
So on a psychological basis, I think people underestimate the level of mental cravings, so there's a difference between having physical cravings, which is actually more withdrawal symptoms, than experiencing cravings mentally. So technically that would be, you're at work, randomly the thought pops up of wanting to use, or like you gave the example of a family event, or maybe even going to church, or whatever the case might be, and randomly the thought comes up. And in that moment, the thought is coupled or linked with such intense emotions that a person almost feels compelled to need to go and fill that impulse. So people often explain, they say, once the craving's there, it doesn't really subside. It comes and goes, but it grows
mental
stronger.
Obsession.
Yes, that mental obsession.
So
exactly.
I think the alcoholics talk about the great obsession of any alcoholic is to be able to drink like a normal person.
Yes.
So it's like, so the obsession takes hold, and we start rationalizing and convincing ourselves, okay, I'll just have one or two. Yeah.
100, and I think that's why I say to my patients, you are technically your own worst enemy, unfortunately, because your brain knows you so well. And just almost like a lawyer or an advocate, their job is to find loopholes in a way to fit the agenda of the case. Your brain kind of goes and looks for loopholes, which it packages in very nice kind of excuses or justifications to say, but you deserve it, or you don't have another option, and as you said, it can sound like thoughts such as, no one will know, it will only be this one. I feel sorry saying no to my mate because they might be, lonely or angry if I say no. I've had a terrible week at work. Everybody else is enjoying themselves. Why can't I? It's end of the month. Got our salary, it's something to celebrate. And I think that's something we also often discuss, is to say, don't just focus on negative triggers. Don't just think things like depression and anxiety and boredom. And I think boredom is a big one that a lot of people tend to overlook. But all those negative emotions, that they are the only forms of cravings or triggers. At the end of the day, you also get a lot of positive triggers, such as the fact that you are wanting to increase a level of happiness or a level of achievement or a level of reward or a level of relaxation.
I think, from my own experience again, when things aren't going too well circumstantially, it's like it can be easy. It's easier to be on guard for those kinds of triggers. But when things are going well, that's when it gets sort of dangerous, because you become complacent, right?
100%. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is we need to look at your psychological dependency on a substance, again, on a continuum, know. And a lot of people will tell me eventually you get to a state where you're stuck in purgatory. Like they say, you're stuck between heaven and hell, because you're not really experiencing much positive, neither negative emotions if you continue using. Because, Brené Brown said, you can't selectively choose what you want to numb. So you want to maybe numb sadness or boredom or anger and increase or heighten relaxation or happiness or confidence. But eventually, as you start numbing the negative, you start numbing the positive as well. And again, then you need to drink more or use more regularly, not only to feel relaxed, but to also increase units of happiness or confidence, or whichever, like I said, positive triggers there may be also for wanting to use. So yes, I think people get into quite a desperate state emotionally, where they get to a point where they feel like life is quite pointless, because every day is rinse, wash and repeat type of thing. And emotionally they just become a little bit despondent, maybe.
Nihilistic.
Yeah, there's no more goals, there's no more dreams, and that's probably one of the main symptoms, is to say that people pull away from meaningful activities. So they will tell me, sure, I used to go play soccer on a Saturday. I never do that anymore. Or I used to go gymming 3 times a week. It feels like effort now.
I mean, it comes back down to values, right? So when you start betraying the values that you profess to have, and you start repeatedly betraying those values, that erodes meaningful sort of, anything meaningful, in fact, right? Meaning is derived from values, right? Yes. From value systems, sure.
I think the psychological dependency also links with your reward system and dopamine. And as we know, at the end of the day, when you are using and especially abusing or misusing substances, you are overflooding your brain with dopamine, which is technically your happy feel chemicals. But the problem is the more you overflow your brain, or what is it?
Flood your brain.
Yeah, the more you flood your brain with these chemicals, the more your brain's way of trying to correct that is to stop producing any dopamine. So then you go into a form of like dopamine starvation or deprivation, which makes people then also feel quite dissatisfied or unfulfilled or bored. So, a lot of people will tell me, going and having a nice piece of chocolate cake at a cafe, or going and having a nice dinner with friends, or maybe playing a game of FIFA on PlayStation, it doesn't give me that satisfaction anymore, you know. So I don't really get joy or a form of excitement or enthusiasm from anything, really. So I think about the things that used to give me a sense of happiness, and I'm thinking, it would be nice, but it would probably be nicer being under the influence and doing those things, and especially with cannabis addiction, that's what we often find, is that people would say, I couldn't even, never mind doing chores and all the things we don't want to do, it's easier to try, or they feel like it's easier to do it on the substance. Eventually, even the things that should not feel like effort, should feel like a reward or something relaxing to do, seems like it's falls short, or seems like it, it doesn't live up to what it used to be. And then people would go to the movies under the influence, or like I say, go to a meal under the influence, because they feel like they can't enjoy it anymore without being intoxicated.
So again, it comes back down to really, how do I know I've got a problem? Well, what sort of problems are you experiencing as a result of the using? And if there's a level of denial for people that might not think they have a problem, but they're experiencing challenges, interpersonal challenges, social challenges, things like that, then it's, go and see a professional and have a conversation with them. At least, give it a shot. See, maybe you'll spot something that, or maybe they'll point you in the right direction, and you'll see something that you can't see, or that you wouldn't see without seeing the professional, right?
On the one hand, I think it's also important, if you look at your life as a pie chart and you had to kind of divide it into percentages, how much time you spend at work, how much time you spend with family, on your own self-care. A lot of people would say, yes, but I only used 2 or 3 hours a day, as an example, and there's 24 hours in a day. But they're losing sight of the fact that you're not just counting the hours that you were physically using or intoxicated. You are also counting the hours you spent fantasizing or obsessing about using, planning on using, then
Recovering.
actually getting the actual substance and ingesting it, and being under the influence, plus then recovering from the substance. So if you color all of that in, people would often say, sure, I actually spent 90% of my time directing my energy towards substances. So even though I was at work, or even though I was at church or with the family, I wasn't really there. I wasn't really present. I was actually sitting with a hangover, or my brain was thinking about using and how I'm going to get it and pay for it. And I think that's what makes it miraculous, that children can often tell me, I can see my dad or my mom, they're there, but they're not really there. Physically they're there, but emotionally there's, they feel that disconnect at the end of the day. So,
Lario, for me, things like, you made a really good point there. I think for me, things like the biological aspect of it, so going through the withdrawals, those are very, very obvious signs that there's a problem, right? And by the time you get to that point, it's like it's like glaring, right? I think for me, the again, the betraying of the values, it can start slowly but surely, right? Like a slow drip. That's where it can kind of like sneak up on you.
yes.
Obviously, the more often you do something, like if you form a habit, or whatever the case, right? But I think with substances, you literally change how your brain functions, and the neural pathways and connections and all that kind of thing, right? But for anybody, I think that isn't sure, I think it comes back down to interpersonal relationships. Are those sort of falling apart? Are there issues there that are starting to become unmanageable? And for me as well, values. I say I want to spend time with my kids, but I'm off at the bar, sort of drinking.
I'm in debt.
Yeah.
And I'm lending money.
But I'm
from
blowing
all
money
sorts.
on gambling because I'm an addict, a gambling addict or whatever. Sure.
Yes, and like you said, I think
working
defense
my way.
mechanisms probably is a very good, because I think I said it in our first podcast, is you don't really need to complicate diseases. Every single disease has common symptoms associated to it. And if you see addiction as a disease, there's common symptoms. Again, they're on a continuum. So you might be experiencing very mild symptoms. That doesn't mean you don't have a flu, as an example. Because you have a slight runny nose and a cough, doesn't mean you don't have a flu. You might just have a milder version of a flu. But if you don't treat that flu, it will probably develop into bronchitis or
something scary.
Something hectic. So I think, to summarize, we are technically saying that the common symptoms are powerlessness, or to put it in a different way, a lack of control or minimized control. Unmanageability is that your life gets unmanageable. It feels like a roller coaster, or that you're juggling because you start experiencing problems interpersonally, in your work or studies, on a physical level, on an emotional level. And then denial, very common symptom, probably the most common symptom of them all, the first symptom. And that's where the defense
You don't know
mechanisms come in.
if you're in denial, you don't know that you're in denial, right?
Yeah, true. But unfortunately,
Or do you think on some level people know?
I think they know on some level. I mean, you can't think of a counter argument if you're not arguing something. You get what I'm saying?
Okay.
So at the end of the day, if you feel like you need to defend yourself, then clearly you're defending yourself for something or because of something. So I do think there's on some level a realization when or specifically when one would want or would pinpoint that can be different for every person. Yeah, and then the hitting rock bottom where at some point, you get to a point where you realize you can't carry on like this and somebody else might be realizing it for you. That's the sad part as well. But like you said, I think without complicating it, if you are experiencing problems, any issues because of your substance use, there's an issue. And again, like you said, you can be with 20 other people and they might not admit to or acknowledge that they're experiencing financial problems or interpersonal problems, but we don't always know what's happening behind closed doors. And for some people, they might not have as many relationships, so they're not experiencing as many relationship issues, or they might, not necessarily blow all of their money, their salary on alcohol, although it might seem like they're drinking every weekend.
I think everything that we've discussed applies to a spouse or a family member that might also be have some level of denial around what's going on. Like I know of spouses that the husband's not home, disappears for a weekend, and it's sort of like Wednesday, you find him parked outside with the motor running and he's fallen asleep behind the wheel of the car, and they kind of like let it sort of slide. I think for them as well, the denial can creep in, and they can sort of like help. That almost turns. They end up enabling the person, right? So all of the same symptoms apply. I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Okay.
That's why I always say to the patients as well, when you come in, every emotion that you've experienced, your family members have also experienced them. It's actually
probably tenfold.
Yeah, it's like mirror.
Because they don't get wasted and forget about it.
Yes. Yeah. So I think the moment you also have to excuse behavior on behalf of somebody, there's also a problem.
Okay.
If you have to excuse and have to make up explanations or justify or rationalize your partner or your spouse or your child or your parents' behavior, and there's a little bit of embarrassment or associated with it, some alarm bells should be going off at the end of the day.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Lario.
Yeah, biggest
Awesome.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Cool.
See you next time.